Hey everyone, how's it going? Stefan here. Whether Neanderthals made art or not is one of the most controversial but interesting aspects of modern research for sure. Luckily for me and you, Dr. Wragg Sykes, a Paleolithic archaeologist, Neanderthal expert, author, and all-round good egg for hopping onto my channel, agreed to talk through some of these issues, from the controversy to the evidence and how it affects our perspective of Neanderthals and our relationship to them. Super interesting, really changed how I view Neanderthals, so sit back, relax, make yourself a cup of tea. I'm sure you will enjoy what she has to say. Thank you so much for joining me on here and sharing your knowledge with my viewers. I know we all really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's always nice to talk about something that you're passionate about.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're all definitely passionate about Neanderthals here on my channel. So can I start by asking, how controversial is the idea of Neanderthal symbolism and art in the wider academic community? And is it still very controversial, or is it gaining acceptance?
I think it's safe to say it's the key area where there are still large disputes. Since really the past 10 years, or just under 10 years, since we had the ancient genetic evidence that has laid out that there were deep connections between our population and Neanderthals. So when I say our population, I mean Homo sapiens, living people. The majority of living people have a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. That didn't used to be believed to be the case. The dominant theory in human origins was based on a lot of different evidence, including the mitochondrial DNA, which suggested that there wasn't any ancestry in us, but it took the nuclear DNA, which arrived in 2010, to show that that wasn't the case, and they are part of our direct hominin ancestry. And until that point, that was one of the big sort of issues of debate. And now that has been pretty much laid to rest. We can't argue about that. The issue of symbolism, cognition, parallels in behavior has really remained debated over, and quite contentious in some aspects, definitely.
So what are the points of contention, mainly revolving around the dating of the sites? Is that the issue, and whether they are sort of accurately dated enough to predate Homo sapiens in Europe? Is that where the controversy still lies?
No, not really. I'd say, I mean, it depends. The real controversy, I suppose, is what one regards as evidence of particular levels of behavioral sophistication, in terms of, if you want to talk about technological complexity, but in terms of symbolic thought, sort of abstract thought, the ability to displace yourself in time and space and imagine other things and play in your imagination. So, play with categories of ideas and things like that. That does still raise issues, in that one scholar might see a kind of evidence, say a site with red pigment, and interpret that in a particular way that would support symbolic behavior, whereas another scholar might see the same evidence and see it quite differently. So nobody would be able to have an argument that could be supported these days, where you could say that there's drastic differences in the actual archaeology, with the exception of a couple of sort of factors that I can go into more detail about. So, but in terms of comparing Neanderthals to contemporary Homo sapiens, so when I'm talking about contemporary, I'm talking older than 40,000 years. So that would be Homo sapiens from mostly the Middle Stone Age in Africa, pre 40,000. Although that has begun to change. But generally, the evidence that we used to regard as quite sort of striking and not shared with Neanderthals, so things like shells or pigments, bone tools, that those borders between early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals have really become fuzzy in terms of the actual evidence that we now have. So the remaining argument is about what those things mean, and that's really where you kind of have to go off into understanding other fields like neuroscience or sort of art theory and things like this. So it does become sort of bedded somewhat into particular scholars who may have long-standing theories that look very different with the evidence we have now compared to what they might have looked like 20 years ago. So that's kind of where the controversy still exists.
Okay, that's interesting. That's not where I thought it would be. I thought the debate would be more that the presence of symbolism wasn't up for debate. It was about whether it could be accurately dated to a Neanderthal time period. So that's
well, it's kind of both.
Yeah.
I mean, if we take pigment, so pigment, so I mean like minerals that produce color. So that could be red ochre, which will be like iron is producing the color there, and there's variations on that. You can have yellowy ones or orange ones or very red ones. Or you can have black pigment, which could be charcoal, but you can also have mineral pigments, manganese pigments often, but there are others. So the reason people get so excited about pigment, obviously, is because the use of color is a foundational thing that most people understand is the visual basis of art. Visual art is other kinds of art, obviously. So if we have a prehistory going way back where people are collecting minerals, processing them into powders, the question then is why? And because we are coming from a position of hindsight, we're looking back with the wonders of the Upper Paleolithic painted caves in our eyes, and we're trying to see the origin of that. Looking for the use of pigment in the absence of any art, it seems obvious as a place to begin, trying to understand whether there was a sort of a nascent symbolic understanding purely through the use of colour. The problem is that you can potentially use minerals like ochre for other things. So in the history of sort of where we see pigment and when, it's quite different now, as I say, than it was a few decades ago. Everybody, was looking to see the earliest painted caves and things like that. And that remains now. It's still about 40,000, 39, 40. That's the earliest dates that we have for any kind of painting on a wall. The big change is that what was the really early sites, which were Chauvet in Europe, or some potential early pieces of stone in Africa that had some figurative designs in black on that may have come off a wall. They weren't so well dated, but they could have been about 40, but that's not quite so sure. So it was like Africa and Europe, which seemed to make sense if you were coming from a traditional understanding that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa and then moved out of Africa. So that made sense. But the big change there is that we now have painted caves dated to exactly the same time, 40,000 in East Asia, Southeast Asia. So that has changed, but that still gives what we currently have. There is still like a border there that we don't find any painted caves earlier than that. And those are all, as far as we can tell, associated with Homo sapiens. So in terms of what we have for Neanderthals, the age of what we have for Neanderthals is not really an issue because we have very old use of pigment in Europe between 250 to 200,000. And that's interesting because it's not just sort of a lump of red stuff from a cave. It's actually an open air site where analysis of the sediments pulled out very tiny, basically splashes of what must have been a liquid red ochre, essentially. So that immediately sort of doesn't really fit in with the use of dry powders for something. It still doesn't mean that that has to be related to kind of any kind of painting in the sense of what we would be thinking of with Upper Paleolithic paintings. But are Neanderthals processing pigment into liquids during a time when we have absolutely no evidence there's Homo sapiens around? Yes. There's no question that that was going on very, very early. But yeah, the question then is, well, all these pigments that we find, is there any evidence that would push it towards being something that is non-functional?
Can I ask what are the sort of alternate uses of the pigment? If they weren't using it for art, what else could they have possibly been doing with it?
You can use pigments for any range of stuff. I mean, it's once you start to kind of get your head that color or just pigment doesn't have to be about art, and you actually look at ethnographic literature, there is a lot of different things. So you might use ochres for hafting. So they use when you want to stick a stone tool to a wooden or some other kind of handle, and you need to make an adhesive. We know Neanderthals were doing that in actually quite varied ways now. We have multiple different materials. They used bitumen, natural bitumen. They used birch tar, and they used pine tar mixed quite amazingly with beeswax. That's a very recent find, just this year that came out. That still blows my mind, actually.
Wow.
I haven't quite worked out what to think about that. But in ethnographic contexts and in the early Homo sapiens sites in South Africa, people were using hematite or other minerals in the adhesive stuff that they had, which was plant-based but different to what Neanderthals were using, because it improves basically the material qualities. So that's been an argument that maybe it was to do with hafting. We have never found any traces of minerals being used by Neanderthals in hafting, so that's possible, maybe not. But you could, I mean, people use minerals traditionally on their bodies for protection from the sun. It doesn't have to be something that's to do with aesthetics. It can just be to do with skincare.
That sort of never even crossed my mind before.
Yeah,
that they might have used it for something like that.
Yeah, you could be putting it on you for camouflage purposes. I mean, we're assuming that based on sort of biological and thermoregulation principles, a lot of the time when it was in the cooler periods, in the glacial periods, Neanderthals had to have been wearing some kind of reasonably tailored clothes. So we're not talking about furs flapping around, in the icy winds. That wouldn't have cut it. But during the warmer periods, because they did live in interglacials in times warmer than today even, or rather where we are heading, they wouldn't have needed those clothes. And it was quite hot during some time. So potentially if they had fairer skin, which we believe that they did, some of them did, not all of them, some had darker skin, then some kind of covering of the skin using mineral pigments, that might make sense too. And also you can use, one of the big things that we know that they spent a lot of their time doing was processing animal skins. And again, that could be clothes, but there's so many other things you can use skins for, including bags. You had to carry their stuff around somehow, and their babies. Hide wraps for babies could be the original reason why you would begin to process skins. But anyway, using mineral pigments as an aid to processing animal skins is another real possibility. So there are actually a lot of different angles that you might think of as to why powdered or liquid minerals could be in a Neanderthal site. So what you want really is a context where the pigments are associated with something that doesn't have any obvious functional use. I mean,
something really unambiguous.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the caveat there, is that Western philosophical traditions like to separate things into binaries: nature, culture, art, practical, everyday stuff. That's not how all cultures think. So it's perfectly possible for something to be massively symbolic and aesthetic and art, and also just be something that you use every day and it's vital to your survival. So bearing that in mind, that something can be both, we still, as archaeologists, want to have a situation where it's very difficult to say that pigment associated with something else is actually, just something that they were using, and there isn't some other explanation. So that's what we need for Neanderthals. And now there are sort of more cases of that than there used to be.
So let me ask you this then, whilst we're on it. What are some of the more clear-cut examples of a Neanderthal symbolism, or at least some of the most promising ones that we have?
Okay, well, I can, if I stick with the pigment, because actually pigment sort of doesn't sound very exciting, but it has been one of the areas where we've just slowly amassed a lot of different cases where we have this sort of setting where it's very difficult to see a practical purpose. So one of these is in a site in Belgium. There is some black pigment. Black pigment has been argued potentially in other sites where it's from manganese. People have done some really cool experimental work recently that's shown that actually manganese can be a useful accelerant when you're starting fires. It can basically like reduce the heat, the point at which the fire will spark, and it just makes your fire lighting easier. So black pigment itself does have a practical purpose, but in this site in Belgium, they have small pieces of a siltstone basically that leaves nice marks when it's rubbed, and it looks like, in terms of the size of the piece and everything, they could have been used. They actually washed them before they realized that they were important, the archaeologists, so they can't see little use traces on it. But it's interesting. So that's one case, that there is a black pigment with no possible practical use that we can see. But that's not sort of that impressive. There are other sites where you get pigment on weird things. So one of those is pigment being associated with stalagmites in Romania, in the Carpathians. I think it's in Romania, yeah. And there's a connection between a very weird geological object that was found. It's a geode. It's sort of about the size of a ball that would fit in your hand. It's very, very heavy. Like, you would know if you picked it up, it's just odd. Like it doesn't feel like a normal rock because it's just naturally heavy, and it's very, very dense. And the researchers found this when they were digging the site, and they scanned it and they found it was a geode. But what they noticed was that there were remnants of colour on the surface. It had a crust, a carbonate crust that had formed over it. And when they removed parts of that, they could see that there was pigment, and it was red ochre. And that was actually overlain by some sort of black as well, which they couldn't identify what that was. So this is a very odd geological object that would fit into a long tradition we see in Neanderthals and in other hominins, where they seem to be attracted to odd things. So sort of rocks, basically it's usually rocks, but fossils as well, that cannot have come from the sites that they are found in. They had to have been brought in. There's no, like, it wasn't a flood or anything like that. They had to have been brought in. There's no clear explanation for why they would bring those in, and generally people just refer to them as curiosities. This object would fit into that. I think it could have come from the local geology, but the fact it has pigment on it, that's two strange things. There's this odd geological object, and then you've got the pigment associated with it. So that's kind of like interesting. But in the same cave, from a different layer, there were also found some small sections of stalagmites. So stalagmites are the ones that come up from the ground. And if you get quite thick ones and you chop them in half, or if they're still forming, you can get like little bowls, basically natural bowls, that you can sort of grind a little bit if you need to. But some of those, there are 8 of them, I think, that they found so far, and some of those only on the insides of the little bowl area, there's more of black and red residues. So it's a different layer. It's a later layer, but it's just very interesting that at this site you have pigments that's not naturally, forming within the geology of the site. That pigment couldn't have got on there by accident, basically, and that's on two different strange things in that site. And so that's an interesting case. But if it was alone, you'd be like, well, okay, strange, but it would be an anomaly. But it's not. There are other cases in various sites where we see pigment associated with shells, and shells where
do we presume that they were sort of used as mixing bowls or something like
that? No. Well, we don't know. I mean, in some cases it might be. Generally, it doesn't look like these are shells that are sort of food waste. In some cases it's possible, but in others it really doesn't look like that. There's two nice examples. There's a couple of sites from Spain. One of them has pigment mixes, basically like recipes, where there's different kinds of pigment, different colors, reds and oranges and yellows, but they also have what is some kind of black carbon in it, which might be charcoal or bone, but also pyrite, which is sparkly. It's fool's gold. If you grind that up, that's going to have quite a striking aesthetic quality if you mix it with other powders. And these are associated with shells in one particular site. So there were a lot of headlines when that came out, like, oh, Neanderthals had makeup or they had shell jewelry.
Yeah.
We cannot say that. But there was a mix of minerals that would have been visually striking on shells. Some of these were probably collected for food, but other ones may not have been. So that's interesting. Again, if it was just one site with shells and pigment, okay, fine. But it's not. There is another really cool site, which for me is a bit of a clincher, really. This is an Italian site called Grotta Fumane. And in this, well, it's an amazing site anyway. It has just vast amounts of cool evidence for many different kinds of behaviour. From a layer that's somewhere between about 47 and 45,000 years. There is a shell.
Just for the record, sorry, in case the people listening aren't aware, what's sort of the rough time for Homo sapiens entering Europe, just so we can have that in the back of our minds?
At the moment, the fossil evidence for early Homo sapiens is really minimal, but in terms of the combination of their archaeological signature, what we would believe to be their archaeological signature, and any fossils, there's nobody in southern Europe pre 41,000.
Okay.
Similarly, in northern Europe, there may be. In Eastern Europe, it looks like sort of they're at the fringes, more like 44, 45, maybe not that early, or it's difficult to tell because there are a lot of, I mean, we'll have to get onto this later in terms of what transitional industries are, but generally we would be assuming on the fossil evidence that there was no Homo sapiens in Western Europe until 41 at the earliest, more like 40, I would say.
So anything earlier than 40,000 is...
If you're talking 45 plus, I think most people would accept that just on a date, but also in Fumane, this is in a layer which is absolutely, unarguably classic Neanderthal artifacts. There would be no question about that. So this object is only one of them. It's a tiny fossil shell, so it's a shell, but more interestingly, it's a fossil, so it's nothing to do with food. And that fossil came from deposits, outcrops roughly 100 kilometers away. So this was not that arrived by accident. And microscopic, very careful analysis found that there is red mineral pigment in tiny, tiny little natural pits on the outside of this shell. If you zoom it right in, you can see it. It's only on the outside of the shell and sort of the little lip of the hole. Something that makes it sort of more exciting, but I don't think it even needs it to be a good evidence of symbolism, is that this shell may also have once been threaded onto something, because there is some very sort of distinctive abrasion marks that appear to be sort of linear, as if they were rubbed in the same direction on the lip of the shell. Just the tiny micro scratches, you have to use like very high magnification to see it, but potentially it means that shell had some kind of thread or something going through it and out through a hole in the side.
Wow.
But even without that, you have a fossil which has nothing to do with food. It came from a very long distance, and it has pigment on it. Those three things, if that was in a Homo sapiens site, you wouldn't look twice. You'd just be like, yeah, okay, that is something symbolic. So
yeah, I mean, you can't carry something for 100 kilometers by accident.
well, and that's
It
as
must
the
have
crow
been very
flies as well. You know, I mean, in terms of how many days that object was held on to for, you know, it's interesting. We can't tell, but given that Neanderthals were, all of our evidence says that they were highly mobile. They moved around a lot. They don't seem to have stayed anywhere particularly long. The stuff that they carried was meaningful to them, whether it was vital for survival or something else. But they would have been very choosy about what they chose to carry, because they had to carry everything. They had no transport, no, you know, dogs or whatever to help carry the load. So it was all on their own backs. So even if you're talking about a tiny shell, that's still something that's got to be packed and carried with you. So there's a choice happening there. I can still think of a practical use in a sense. Like potentially shells, if they were all strung together, could have rattled, and maybe that was some kind of thing to do with hunting, but I can't really believe that. I think this shell from Fumane is really strong evidence for me. And because you then look out from that site at all the rest of the sites where we have pigment, there's pigments where they've clearly been rubbed on things. Some pigments have got strange sort of little lines engraved on them. There's the associations of shell at other sites. There's strange geodes. You know, once you start to see the whole picture that we have now, it really starts to look as if something is going on. Doesn't mean everything is symbolic, you know, every site, but once you kind of have this accumulation of stuff, it becomes difficult to say, well, we have nothing. We do have a record that is broadly, I would say, equivalent to what we have for early Homo sapiens in the African contexts. There is shells there. There's pigment. There's a much sort of more impressive little pigment processing kit from a South African site, an early South African site. So that's like about, I think, 80,000, where they have a shell and there's pigment inside it and things like this. And it's just like it was all found together. And so that's kind of, you know, that's like the whole package they've got there. But in terms of if those objects had been found distributed through the cave, it's not that different. And there's no painted art at all in South Africa. So we have to sort of think, well, what were they using their pigment for? Some aesthetic things and some practical things, in as we can see in the hafting. So there's no reason why Neanderthals couldn't have been doing both things in different sites in different places.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
That's why the pigment is really a good example, because the overall amount of stuff we now have means that we have to look at the individual sites differently, I think. Yeah.
I mean, it has, just talking to you now, totally changed how I view Neanderthals in my mind's eye. I mean, I know I shouldn't get carried away like the newspapers always do with imagining them in sparkly makeup, but
well, I don't know. I mean, color and visual appearance, it's a really basic thing for mammals, you know, and chimpanzees in the wild. They're always brought up being our closest primate relative. They don't really do anything like that in the wild. But if you give them in a captive setting, if you give them paint, they go for it. They are aesthetically stimulated by painting, and that's kind of an interesting angle to look at things, really, because the other thing that has kind of been getting people excited about Neanderthals is engravings, and sort of interactions about sort of, cutting into materials rather than covering them with a substance as you would be doing with pigment.
Sorry, I was just going to say, when I was researching the videos that I did on the Neanderthals, one of the examples where I said people were debating it, I think is it Gorham's Cave?
Yeah.
In Gibraltar,
yeah.
where there's sort of like a hash mark on the rock.
Yeah. Gorham's, I mean, I think different people are still of different opinions about that. Sorry, that was my cat knocking over.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the context of that marking, the hashtag, as it was called in the headlines, that is under a load of archaeology basically, so it has to be pretty old and old enough to be Neanderthal. It's covered by layers that look as if they are Neanderthal archaeology, and the question of, well, is the experimental archaeology that's been done to claim that was created intentionally and it wasn't like a bear or something? I think for me, I would buy that as an intentionally created form, partly because there is a lot of evidence from other sites that they were interested in not only in sort of engraving, but just in material properties of things. So, and this is the other thing that you kind of have to have in mind when you're talking about aesthetics or art or engraving, is that Neanderthals they were incredibly picky about what they ate and the materials they used for their practical tools. So they were really careful generally to choose the best rocks for whatever task they were doing. They would carry the higher quality rocks as tools for further. They would resharpen those preferentially. They would only transport the bits of animals from kill sites that had the highest fat or marrow content, and those patterns are repeated everywhere. And then if they're making bone tools from bone, they're really picky about the species or the actual part of the skeleton that they use. So they're like gourmets for materials. They know what they want, very much so. They're aware of the physical properties of things. So that, I think, is interesting in that we see across a number of sites not only this interest in pigments, but of sort of cutting into bones. There's a lot of engravings on bones that people have debated for a long time. Some of those have really not held up, they're just natural. But other ones, when they're examined with modern technologies, modern microscopic analysis, you can see that they're not some sort of natural scratches. And numerous cases have now emerged from sites that are in a good context, they're not old and random stuff, where you have parallel markings. And it seems to be that there is, in some cases, a concern to create series of markings, very careful. They're not sort of graphic designs in the way that the Gibraltar thing seems to have a graphic character to it. With having lines that intersect each other. They're just single lines. They either sort of have an origin point that they all come out from and it kind of looks like a fan shape, or they have these small sort of cuts that seem to be they're parallel. And some really cool analysis has been done, basically like looking at whether you can argue that they're trying to keep the gaps between them consistent, and on some pieces that does seem to be true. So that, at its basic level, that's an aesthetic activity. You're trying to create a visual effect. Whatever the meaning of that is uncertain. But you have that in many sites. It's on animal bones. Sometimes it's on animal bones from species that are not particularly interesting. Other cases, it's from species that are a little bit less common, like bears or birds. And in one case, there's a Neanderthal skull that seems to have some of these markings on. They're very small, but they don't really fit into butchery, because this is from a site where they appear to have been butchering the dead as well, which is a whole other topic. Yeah. But the interesting thing about engravings is it's an interaction with the material, and you get lines in some sites, not hardly any of the pigment sites, but they are still there, where there's pigment seems to have lines on that doesn't really necessarily fit in with trying to get powder off these lumps of pigment. So there's an overlap between two different things that we would otherwise, if it wasn't Neanderthals, we would say that's potentially symbolic, and it's overlapping between those two different sort of aesthetic realms, if you want to call it that. And that really, I think, because we're getting so many different signals for behavior that doesn't really fit anything obviously practical, it all starts to build up. And in terms of comparing it to early Homo sapiens, in some cases Neanderthals have got more, depending on what sort of what area you look at.
That's incredible. I love that. That's totally that sounds very convincing to me. For the like you said, if it was found in a Homo sapiens site, it wouldn't its symbolic nature perhaps wouldn't be questioned, only because it's found in Neanderthal ones.
It is important to remember as well that we talk about the Neanderthals as if they're sort of a monolithic thing, and they definitely wouldn't have been. They lived across a massive geographical range, from Uzbekistan to Wales, into the Altai
That would make
Mountains.
a good show, Uzbekistan to Wales, Neanderthal story.
Yeah, it's a huge range of landscapes, of environments, of animals. Like what they ate in Palestine compared to Germany would have, probably surprised each other. Very different. So we shouldn't expect everything to look the same everywhere. We should expect that what Neanderthals were doing in one place would not have made sense to what other ones did somewhere else. And it's the same thing. We wouldn't expect necessarily that to be the case for early Homo sapiens. And also there's the question of change through time as well. It has been a trope for Neanderthals for a long time in sort of human origins textbooks that it's always claimed, the Middle Paleolithic, so that's their culture. Their broad culture basically did nothing and didn't evolve at all for the entire time that they were around, from about 400, 350,000 until 40,000, and that's totally changed. Nobody, I think, who knows the stone tools would argue that there was massive change over time in terms of sort of little flowerings of what was going on in particular regions. There were technological traditions that were very long lived, but it wasn't just sort of one thing happening the entire time. It was really varied. And so we should expect that other things, aesthetic traditions, symbolic activities, would have been changing over time as well as across space. And I was actually going to say one of the other really intriguing sites that probably, well, I know it has, because I asked colleagues to tell me what they thought the most sort of jaw-dropping recent thing was, and basically everybody came out with the same site, which is a French site called Bruniquel in southwest France. That doesn't have pigment, but it does have stalagmites again. And this is a site, people can find it online because there's lots of images of it. Basically, it's a very deep cave, 300 meters or so deep into this hill, and there's a chamber where cavers had found these bizarre, large sort of rings of broken pieces of stalagmite. And it was dated, radiocarbon dated. It came out as older than 40,000. So people are like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. But if you date really old stuff with radiocarbon, it basically gives you infinite dates, and it could be anything. Yeah. So when that was re-examined, that came out to be about 174,000 years old.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah, it's super interesting, that site, because it's kind of described as just arranged rings of stalagmites, and then like with these little piles in the middle. But it's a lot more than that. It's a built structure, albeit on a small level. So it's not like a big built wall, but in micro scale, it is a built wall, because they haven't just kind of like shoved them together. There are parts in these rings where they've got like 2 or 3 things balanced on top of each other, like verticals and then a flat one and then other ones on top of that. Or there's like several long ones all lined up together, leaning against the wall. That is an absolute sort of miniature megalithic structure, if you want to call it that. It's not just kind of like something. It's not, bears didn't do it.
A mini megalithic structure.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you know, we don't have the language for this. It's interesting, you know, question as to what we actually call it. But there's a lot of burning as well. In amongst this, the stalagmites, some of them were really heavily burned, and there seems to be like hearths that were built along the, or in, I don't know, it's really hard. It's so hard to know what's going on. That site was very recently found, a couple of years ago. Well, not found, but published. An analysis is still ongoing. There is a flowstone floor that this is basically on, so we can't see the surface of the cave floor because it's covered by the natural flowstone that came over it afterwards. That's also incidentally how some of this was dated, because there was flowstone that was over these rings later in time. So the dating is very good for this site. But nobody really would be living in that cave because it's 300 meters in. You would have terrible smoke if you try to illuminate it, not to mention sort of having to continually bring fuel in to have light, do anything. So there's no way this is a site that they were living in. So, and then if you add up,
it just goes to show the extraordinary amount of effort they must have had to put into.
Well, yeah,
piling up
you
those
can do
rocks.
you can do a back of the envelope calculation on how long it would have taken to make that, and even if you sort of assume several of them doing, it's about 2 tons is the amount of stuff that is arranged. It would be at least 6 or 7 hours. You know, that's my little basic calculation. They must have been under there for like hours and hours, maybe even days, doing this. We have no clue why. So that's not pigment. It's not paintings on the wall. It's not a carving, but that is something. I don't even know if I call that aesthetic, because it's a little bit, you know, like the arrangements of stones in South America. You can only see the visual effect from above, but the arrangement, it's not necessarily the visual side of it is not the important thing necessarily. The creation of it itself could have been the thing that was meaningful. And this is where I want to come back to the engravings, because for some of those we might be focusing too much from a cultural position which values final visual effects of things like paintings, whereas actually that's not necessarily the thing that may have had the meaning. It may have been the actual creative act itself could have had a meaning or an importance to the person doing it or people watching or whatever. So I think really we need to open up how our own expectations of what symbolic behavior might actually look like or feel like, or sound like, you know, anything. So that's kind of where we are with Neanderthals for me, that there is an abundance of archaeology that we have now. It's just bringing together what that means in terms of their minds is the really, really difficult thing.
That's incredible. So let me ask you this. We have all this evidence of symbolic behavior. Does this affect how we view the demise of the Neanderthals in any way, and perhaps transitional stone industries or our relationship with them? How does this affect our view of that?
Well, I guess there's 2 aspects to that. One is the transitional industries, which we don't really have time to talk about. They are actually, I would say, even more contentious than the issue of symbolism. The question of who made what is still very much argued over, and that would be something that would cause the biggest, you know, shouting matches. Or that doesn't happen. If people were going to get into big debates at conferences, it would be that, because the problem with those, what they are basically is, at the very end of the time that we see Neanderthals, the very youngest fossils seem to be followed by stone tool cultures that appear to be presaging the Upper Paleolithic. So they're very bladey, got lots of blades generally, that's the main thing. And they also have objects associated with them that we don't really see in Neanderthals. So Neanderthals might have engraved bone, put lines on them and things, but we haven't seen any like carved forms that are obviously not just changing the shape of your bone tool. You know, there's no sort of pendants or anything. Whereas in the French case, the Chateaubriand, there are apparently pierced teeth, other carved bone things, ivory. So that's just one of them. So there's multiple of these weird, what people call transitional, because the assumption became that this was some kind of transition between Neanderthals and the incoming modern, well, I say Homo sapiens. We shouldn't really say modern human because it's a terrible term. That slipped out.
Yeah.
But yeah, the question is, those layers are often quite thin. They're covering a very short period of time, so dating them is difficult. And in the sites where it appears that there may be Neanderthal material, as in fossil material with them, bones or teeth, they don't have the best contexts. There is either uncertainty as to whether those layers were actually in the original position, or whether there's been erosion. And for example, some of the most quoted sites, nobody's ever done full refitting. So that's where you get all your stuff out across different layers and you check to see if anything is broken that is between two different layers. If that is the case, that was one object that is now in two layers, that tells you that material has moved, and that those layers are not 100% reliable. You know, you can't be sure whether the pendant that is in that layer really was in that layer. And so the sites which have most of the very impressive stuff that also seems to have Neanderthal fossils also remain to be proven to be completely, well, we can't ever say completely, but very confidently undisturbed, basically. So that's the problem with the transitional industries, especially the classical ones in France and elsewhere. So I would say, for me, I don't think there's great evidence that Neanderthals made those, whereas other people would argue the opposite. But for me, I like to be very cautious, and I would like to see them all have refitting studies, and I'd like to only look at sites where we have very solid dating, and then old sites dug a long time ago, things like that. So if you remove all of those, it doesn't leave a lot of great evidence that Neanderthals made that stuff. So if we say, okay, we're not going to talk about the transitional industries, if we're only going to talk about what we know, which is that there certainly was some late interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Looks like there was a lot of stuff going on much earlier, but we know there was some late interbreeding because there is a modern human jaw from Eastern Europe that dates to about 39,000, and that individuals had a Neanderthal ancestor somewhere between 4, I think, to 6 or 7 generations before. So that is very, very close in time to when that interbreeding happened. Whether that was in Eastern Europe or not, you know, how much space could a group move over 6 or 7 generations? Probably quite a lot, but it's still, the point is still there that we know that there was definitely interbreeding going on at a late period in time, when we therefore have a big history of Neanderthals having aesthetic, interesting things that they were doing, whether it's with pigments or whatever. The question there for me is, what does that mean in terms of their symbolic capacity? Well, it just adds to the reasons why we would want to make babies with each other. That I don't really buy the explanation that everything was some sort of territorial argument with, you know, forced intercourse between, you know, groups that got, I don't know, cut off. I mean, you can look at chimpanzee cases, they sometimes do that, but it's very rare. As I understand it, I'm not DNA specialist at all, but as I understand it, the amount of genetic material that is in living people is high enough that these can't have been sort of one-off encounters, like a handful of them over 50, 60, 100,000 years. There's multiple phases of when it happened, but we're probably looking at contexts where interactions were happening in reasonable numbers. Can't put a case on that, but
it wasn't an isolated incident.
I don't think so. And if that's the case, then you have to talk about, who was raising the babies, and then you stop talking about sort of like physical encounters, and you say, well, a baby that is brought into a group, whether it was going into a Neanderthal group or to a Homo sapiens group, or whether they merged groups, we have no idea. If that was happening, there had to have been enough of a comparable, I guess, broad cultural worldview that those children would not sort of, just be left or abandoned or sort of grow up unable to function. Hybrids had to be able to function in whichever societies they were brought up in, and therefore there couldn't have been a massive gulf, is what I'm trying to say. Even if there were groups with different traditions or different aesthetic or symbolic understandings, I think there had to have been some common ground in terms of there being more than simply they were hunting. They could recognize that they were both hunters or something like that. That they were peoples that hunted. That would be a common ground. I think there probably was something beyond that would explain why you would have so many hybridizations that were successful, basically. That those hybrids then went on to have their own children and stuff. Otherwise, we wouldn't have that material in us today.
They must have been able to fit in with their society for people to want to reproduce with them and continue having families with them.
Exactly. There had to be a level of communication. There had to have been, all those things. So that's not necessarily, I don't want to say they were the same, because I don't think there are clear differences still in the record. I mean, I think the way that Homo sapiens were living, I think they were probably hunting differently. I think they were organizing themselves in the landscape differently. I think they probably were had more extensive social networks. I think that's pretty well supported. And the key difference by 40,000 is that, as I said, that's when you have the earliest dates for cave art. That's representational images, animals basically, and handprints. There is very new research that suggests that there may be one handprint in Spain that's much older than that, sort of maybe 50,000. But at the moment, that's those sites. For me, I'd like to see a more extensive analysis of the caves where those are, to see if there's more of those of handprints with the same similar ages, before I want to sort of be sure about what those actually are. But in terms of what we accept as, was there anybody around that was Homo sapiens in Europe, where these paintings on walls and this potential hand, it's not a print actually, it's a negative, it's probably had the pigment blown around it and you take your hand away. Those could be Neanderthal stuff, or they could be odd little very brief incursions of Homo sapiens. And that is possible because there is also a transitional industry before the transitional industries, if you want to call it that, in France, in southern France, southeast France, called the Neronian, which has some aspects that look similar to what Neanderthals do, but also not. Some of the stone tool technology there is comparable to what Neanderthals do, but it's much smaller, and it has very definite similarities to the earliest transitional industries in Eastern Europe, which are only about 5,000 to 10,000 years younger. Which, okay, I'm saying only 5,000 to 10,000 years younger, but that's how we talk when we talk about the Paleolithic.
That's a short time.
Yeah, that stands out. That's a strange thing, the Neronian. So I think basically the red lines that we used to have, that everything, what I was saying earlier, everything before 40,000, we can be sure it's Neanderthal. In some cases, it is a little bit uncertain. But certainly Neanderthals were still around until 40,000, but there may be brief movements of people into Europe before that didn't go anywhere, because that's also something we should remember, that it wasn't just Neanderthals that went extinct, although technically they're not extinct because their material is still in us. And John Hawkes, who I guess some of your listeners might know his website, he's had a great calculation he did where it's like there's more genetic material in living people now than ever walked around, in the Pleistocene, in terms of what's around now. So they're not actually extinct
just
in
in
that
terms
sense.
of the sheer numbers
In
of
terms
people.
of, bodies, as them by themselves walking around, but they're still here in that sense. But there certainly are very early Homo sapiens in Eurasia, where we can tell from the DNA that they have no living relatives. So there were waves of people coming and going, possibly coming and going backwards again through Eurasia. We've only at the very beginning of trying to actually map out what the genetics means in terms of the sites that we have. But some of those individual fossils that we have, which we know are Homo sapiens, they went extinct more than the Neanderthals. There's nobody alive that has their material in now. So
wow.
in terms of this idea that we succeeded, and we were the victors, and the Upper Paleolithic marks some kind of great victory, it's not as simple as that at all.
That sounds extremely complicated. But
Yeah.
that's really changed my perspective on the Neanderthals, because I am a very cautious guy as well. I didn't want to sensationalize my viewers with tales of Neanderthal art, but that all sounds really very convincing and very interesting. And I know everyone who's listened to this has found it fascinating. So I'd really like to thank you for coming on my channel and help explaining that to me and the viewers. I know we appreciate it a great deal, so thank you.
Oh no, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's difficult to explain because the stuff that hits the headlines is often really exciting, but it's kind of having that context around it and understanding the breadth of what we have. It can really change, what one site might mean, and that's what doesn't always sort of get communicated in the press or on TV or whatever like that. So I mean that is what I'm trying to do with my book, is give people a deep dive into the data that will make more sense of why people, why there's headlines coming out all the time that can seem contradictory, like, oh, Neanderthals weren't so stupid, or oh, that's why they died out. That's very contradictory for people to hear those two different narratives, that they weren't so stupid, but here's why they were rubbish. And actually the symbolism and the aesthetics is a really key area where it's not often explained well enough to people.
Yeah. And when is your book coming out?
Summer next year, 2020.
Summer next year. Look out for it, everyone. Dr. Wragg Sykes. She's going to set the record straight on Neanderthals. Context is key,
Yes.
as you heard. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.